Hello, this is Sondra Oster Baras bringing you a few words of Bible from the heart of Biblical Israel. This week's Torah portion is Balak, and it's a very interesting Torah portion because the entire Torah portion is a story that takes place between Balak, the Moabites, the Midianites, a man named Balaam, who is a prophet, not of Israel. It all takes place in the shadow and about Israel, but there's absolutely no participation throughout the entire Torah portion of anyone from Israel, okay? Certainly until except for the very end of the Torah portion, we have already the beginning of chapter 25, not including that, chapter 20, beginning with chapter 22, until the end of chapter 24, is an entire story that takes place about the nation of Israel that, as far as we can tell, the nation of Israel may not even be aware of, certainly as it's going on. They seem to find out about it later, or at least to some extent. But at this point in time, they have no idea what's going on. What is the story? It's a story about a king, Balak. He's the king of Moab. He clearly is in relationships with the Midianites as well. They seem to work together in this whole story. And he understands that the nation of Israel is on the move, and they're going to first move up the eastern side of the Jordan, then they're going to cross over to the west. They're here to conquer the land. And he is threatened, and he has a very unique plan. Rather than, or at least in addition to getting an army ready to try to fight against these people, he decides he's going to hire a well-known prophet. This fellow Balaam is a prophet. He's a prophet of God, okay? But he's of the nations. He's not a prophet of Israel. And he figures, let me hire this prophet. The guy seems to be a powerful man. I'm going to have him curse the nation of Israel, and then I don't have to worry, because he's going to curse the nation, and then the nation of Israel will not be able to defeat the Moabites and the Midianites. Okay, but of course the plan doesn't work. First of all, Balaam from the beginning, very interesting person. You may ask yourself, what is a man like this doing being a prophet? Okay, let's hold on to that question for a minute. But what you can see from the beginning, this is a man who on the one hand is clearly a prophet of God. He gets messages from God. We see this in this portion. God ends up telling him what to say, and he says it. He is very obedient to God, and he says from the beginning to Balak, it doesn't matter how much gold and silver you give me, I am not going to prophesy something that I am not told by God. So on the one hand, you look at a person like this and you say, wow, he's living in a pagan world, and yet he is totally devoted to God. Not really, okay? This is a man who's, I would call a technical prophet, okay? He is devoted to his prophecy and understands that he cannot lie. If he is going to speak as a prophet of God, then he needs to only say what it is God tells him to say. So in that sense, yes. On the other hand, whenever we meet a prophet who is a real prophet of God, and they are, except for this fellow, they are prophets of Israel, it is not just that they are speaking the word of God. You see them as righteous people who have internalized God's messages. In other words, if they are speaking a message to the world, to the nation, the prophet himself is completely and totally in identification with God's message. He has internalized God's teachings, God's messages, etc. Not Balaam. Because Balaam retains a desire of his own, which is in total contradiction to God. He personally would love to curse Israel. However, he is constrained by God. And here we have a very unusual prophet. Because he's not a prophet in the normal sense. He's a prophet in the technical sense. He does receive God's messages and he conveys them. But he's not a real prophet in that he never internalizes God's message. He's not a servant of God. Not really, okay? Because a servant of God doesn't just mean you're like a shofar, that you're an instrument. You blow through what God gives you and out comes the sound. It's technical. A microphone, perhaps. No, you're not a microphone. You yourself have a person, a message, a personality that is in concert with the message you're bringing for God. And of course, Balaam is not like that. So then, of course, we go back to our original question. Why is it that God would choose a man like this to be his prophet? And the only thing I can think of, and that, and I've actually studied this, and I'm not going to go into the detail because this is not the time or place, but I would say, in short, God uses different people for different purposes. And so even though God is not going to find a person like this who is going to himself be a great man, what he finds in Balaam is the characteristics he needs for Balaam to fill God's role. At this point, God's purposes with Balaam is just to present these blessings instead of the curses, knowing that Balaam is, in fact, an honorable man in the sense that he really will only say what God tells him to say. That's good enough. He doesn't have, maybe there aren't any people out there. I assume there aren't any Midianites and Moabites at that point who are going to be real prophets, okay? So Balaam fits the bill because at least he's a technical prophet. And that is, of course, a lesson to all of us. God chooses all kinds of people, good people and bad people and everything in between, to advance his agendas. But now I would just like to remind you what happens to Balaam at the end. And this is very important because you don't come out of the story feeling that, oh, Balaam's a great guy, let me emulate Balaam. But just in case you missed that point, Bible is going to make sure you understand who it is that Balaam is. And we see that not in this week's Torah portion, but later on, towards the end of the book in chapter 31. So this is at the point at which the nation of Israel then goes into war against the Midianites, and in chapter 31, verse 8, it says, it talks about the people they captured. They took the field against Midian as the Lord had commanded, and slew every male. Along with their other victims, they slew the kings of Midian, Evi, Rechem, Tsur, Hor, and Reba, the 5 kings of Midian. They also put Balaam, son of Beor, to the sword. So in other words, he meets his end. He is killed in this battle. Why, you might ask? Okay, we know he's not a great guy, but he did follow the words of God, and he did prophesy what God wanted him to prophesy, so why? Okay, but then we learn more later on in verse 15 and in verse 16. In verse 16, Moses is making sure that, he's criticizing them because they kept the women alive, and they're saying the women in this case need to be killed. Why? And this is coming on the heels of this terrible situation where the Midianites and the Moabite women seduce the Israelite men and bring them into terrible sin at Baal Peor. But here we have a little piece of information that we don't know from the previous story, and it says as follows. They, meaning the women, are the very ones who at the bidding of Balaam induced the Israelites to trespass against the Lord in the matter of Peor. At the bidding of Balaam. So here we learn that after he finishes prophesying, he goes to these women and he goes to the king of Balak and he says, look, I can't curse them, but I'm going to tell you what to do. Seduce these Israelites. This is their weakness. Bring them into sexual immorality. Bring them into worship of your pagan Baal. That is how you're going to weaken them. And of course, as a result, God brings a plague and so many people are killed. So we learn here the ultimate evil that Balaam really represents. He's a microphone for God, but then when God is not talking to him, he's going around and doing everything he can to harm the nation of Israel. One good thing, though, and this is what kind of I would like to go back and remind us of still in the end, he is what we call the technical prophet, and in the end, he said some very good things. And there's one verse that is something that we quote all the time when we talk about, things that he said, what he said about us, the nation, as he's blessing us, even though he personally wanted to curse us. Chapter 24, verse 5. How fair are your tents, O Jacob, your dwellings, O Israel. And this we interpret to mean not the physical tent or the dwelling, but the family. And I think he puts his finger here on the greatest strength of the nation of Israel, even to this very day, the family structure. We are a nation who from the beginning of time was built around a family. And even today, the Jewish people is built around the family. And for as long as the Jewish family is strong, and it's strong in their internal connections, the Jewish people are strong. And that's something that we see here in Israel today. We are the only Western country today with a rising birth rate. We are the only Western country today where the family, both the insular family and the extended family, are very close, are in touch. We gather every single weekend on Shabbat for meals and gatherings and on holidays. This is very, very strong in Israel, and it is something that in many ways is the key to our existence, the strong family. And Balaam put his finger on that. How fair are the tenth of Israel, the dwellings of the tents of Jacob, the dwellings of Israel. Have a wonderful weekend. Shabbat Shalom.
I hope you enjoyed that video, and we'd like to be sure you're getting all of our video content. So just click on the subscribe button below as well as on the notification bell, and that way you will have easy access to all our material. We look forward to staying in touch with you. God bless you, and have a wonderful day.